If anything, we have to do more philosophy of mind, because now we have to think not only about the conditions for consciousness, but also about the conditions for valence and how consciousness and valence need to be connected in order to add up to sentience. If you imagine a being with consciousness, but without any kind of positive or negative valence, like a pure color perceiver or a pure sound perceiver, but nothing feels good or bad, everything just feels neutral, I have a hard time imagining that there are stakes for that individual.
A lot of the evolutionary story about potentially how consciousness came to emerge was because sentience itself, feeling the valence, was probably the thing that made it adaptive in the first place.
There are also no clear technical barriers towards the development of AI systems with advanced and integrated versions of all of these capabilities. If we invest in building knowledge, building capacity, building political will, we could improve our impacts on local and global, present and future, human and non-human stakeholders.
I guess that's Smokey there, is it?
Yeah, here. He is,
Hey,
right
Smokey.
here, taking a little nap.
Good morning, Jeff. How are you?
Hi, good. How are you? Good morning.
Really good. Well, it's wonderful to have you on as a repeat guest. We had a great conversation back in episode 26, where we already answered the sort of central sentientism questions of what's real and how do we understand, how do we go about working out what's real and true, who matters and what matters.
Nice to get all of that out of the way in one conversation.
So easy. It was so easy. And then how do we make a better future, right? So that was, we're done and dusted on that. And here what I wanted to focus on, in a way, is going back over some of those questions, because your latest book, The Moral Circle, hits that second question really hard, who matters, but then what are the implications of that, and how should we work that through into how we think about how to make a better world? So it'd be great to dig into that today. So congratulations on getting the book out. And it was also great to see it was endorsed on the back cover by two of my other guests, Peter Singer and Barbara King too. So it's nice. And there's a lot of connections there with other guests. And of course, you cite many of the people I've had the honor of talking to in this podcast series too. But before we get on to working through the book and some of its main themes, I guess that's Smokey there, is it?
Yeah, here. He is,
hey,
right
Smokey.
Here, taking a little nap, participating in the episode.
Awesome. Luna's downstairs, but she might make a guest appearance later on. We'll see.
Okay.
And the book's dedicated to Smokey, I think. Yeah.
It is dedicated to Smokey, yeah.
Absolutely. So before we get on to the book and its themes, how would you best introduce yourself for those who missed our first episode or haven't come across your expansive work already? And to be honest, even the people who listen to episode 26 will need an update, because you're adding programs and jobs and initiatives and books every time I turn around. So
Sure. So my name is Jeff Sebo. I am a philosopher by training, and I teach at New York University, primarily in the environmental studies department, though I also work with bioethics and medical ethics and philosophy and law. And I, broadly speaking, ask how humans can better interact with the non-human world. And that includes a lot of the questions that the conversation today will address. Who might matter? How much might they matter? What might they need? What might we owe them? What follows for our actions and policies and priorities? And without going into detail about all of the little projects and programs, I can note briefly that at NYU, in addition to working in environmental studies, I direct the Center for Environmental and Animal Protection. And this is a research center that examines important issues at the intersection of environmental and animal protection. And so that includes issues related to agriculture and farmed animal welfare, biodiversity and wild animal welfare. And then I also direct the recently launched Center for Mind, Ethics, and Policy. This is a research, outreach, and field building center that examines the nature and intrinsic significance of non-human minds, with special focus on invertebrates and AI systems because of their importance and difficulty as research subjects. And so probably our conversation today will straddle those topics, but maybe focus a little bit more on the latter topic, who might matter and how much might they matter.
Yeah, thank you. And a good place to start, I guess, would be to just frame the big picture of what you're trying to achieve in the book, because it clearly feeds into all of those agendas, is addressing that central question of who matters and what the implications are. So I'm interested in, how would you, big picture, introduce the book? But maybe a slightly cheeky question to start. many people are familiar with the idea of a moral circle, but does it need to be a circle? Because some people are almost nervous that there's some implications in it being a circle. Does it necessarily center us? Do you get less important as you get out towards the edges? I don't.
Yeah, I actually did think long and hard about the metaphor as I was starting the project, and actually as I was starting work on a paper that preceded the project. And I was concerned about the metaphor partly for that reason, because it implies that humanity is at the center of the circle and that other beings matter or are closer to the center to the degree that they resemble us. And I was concerned about that possible implication. Also, there are other types of spatial metaphors that could be interesting to explore. So, for example, you might think of a sphere, and that would allow for more directionality, or you could imagine a cone where it would include sort of space and time, right? Not only an expanding community, but then also expanding into the future. And so I played with those. I ultimately decided to stick with the circle, however, not for any really good conceptual or substantive reason, but rather because I decided that the project was going to be provocative and alienating enough without also switching metaphors up on people. And so I decided to keep a familiar, recognizable metaphor and then offer some challenging ideas within that metaphor. But yeah, no, really great question to start with. I think a good set of issues for us to keep in mind.
And I can see that, right? You start with something familiar and then you blow people's minds once they're into the book rather than, yeah. And how would you frame the overall story of the book that you lay out?
The overall question of the book is exactly as we were saying before: which beings might matter and what might we owe them and what might follow for our policies and priorities. And we can start with the observation that while views about this issue are shifting, we right now at least increasingly agree that all humans and many non-human animals like mammals and birds merit consideration in decisions that affect them. But the book asks, should we go farther? And if so, how far should we go? And what should the details be? And again, what are the implications? And what I planned to argue when I started writing the book was that we should go quite a bit farther, for example, by including all vertebrates and many invertebrates and some near future AI systems in our moral circle for reasons that we can discuss. That would already be very significant moral circle expansion. But I surprisingly and distressingly found myself committed by my own arguments to potentially going even farther than that. For example, extending at least a little bit of consideration to plants, fungi, microscopic organisms, maybe even current or very near future AI systems. And that is an even more surprising, even more, at least for me, distressing set of possible implications. And so it might be interesting to discuss why I found myself committed to those conclusions and what might follow from those conclusions.
Yeah, thank you. And those of us who've, vocal vegans on Twitter will have heard the plants feel pain response enough times to feel a bit of dissonance as we listen to that. I was to explore the the arguments and the ideas, but it's a fascinating way you tell the story. So we can dig into that a little bit later on. And maybe a good place to start as you went on that journey yourself is to think about, if we're working out who matters and how big this circle or this shape or this sphere or this cone should get and who's inside it, what are the criteria we should use to take that judgment? So what do you settle on? Because again, there's lots of different ways of judging who might matter.
Yes. And that starting observation that there are a lot of different ways of judging who might matter is key to the framework and the argument and recommendations that I lay out in the book. So just to flesh that idea out a little bit, there are, of course, a lot of secular and religious philosophical worldviews about the basis for moral standing. And obviously, some are more plausible and widely accepted in contemporary philosophy than others. But just to take a few examples, you might think sentience is required for moral standing, the ability to consciously experience positive and negative states like pleasure and pain. Or you might think that consciousness without sentience is enough for moral standing, the ability to have subjective experiences, to have subjective feelings, even if they lack a positive or negative valence. Or you might think that agency without consciousness is enough for moral standing, the ability to set and pursue your own goals based on cognitive states that function like beliefs and desires, even if it feels like nothing to be you. And what I argue in the book is that we might have our own view about that debate. I, like you, lean towards the sentience view, that sentience is both necessary and sufficient for moral standing. But given how difficult these issues are, given how many smart people disagree about them, given how many smart people have been confidently wrong in conveniently exclusionary ways about them in the past, given that ultimately we need to be making these decisions together in the context of ongoing disagreement about these issues, for all of these reasons, I think that accepting at least a weakly pluralistic view is valuable. So even if I feel confident that sentience is both necessary and sufficient for moral standing, I ought to give at least a little bit of weight to other reasonable views, like the consciousness view or the agency view, and explore their implications as well, in the spirit of caution and humility and collaboration in the context of disagreement and uncertainty.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I really like the book and the way you think generally is that humility that leads to a pluralism, and as you say, it's and that way of dealing with uncertainty that is not just about collaboration and bringing people on the journey with us and teaming up with people who might disagree. It is also a genuine philosophical ability to cope with the fact that we might be wrong. So so I appreciate that pluralism, although as you say, I tend to zero in on sentience and ask questions about why you need anything else and if you need anything else. On the thing that I guess we're going to struggle to disagree on, that sentience is a really relevant, important thing. If someone asks you, okay, why is sentience important in moral consideration? How do you explain that? Why do you think sentience is important?
Yeah, I think there are different ways to answer that question, but a short and sweet way to answer the question is to say that you need to be able to have feelings or experiences that feel good or bad to you in some way or another in order for it to matter to you what happens to you, in order for it to matter to you what happens in the world. If you imagine a being with consciousness, but without any kind of positive or negative valence, like a pure color perceiver or a pure sound perceiver, but nothing feels good or bad, nothing feels to be done or not to be done, everything just feels neutral. I have a hard time imagining that there are stakes for that individual in what happens to them or in what happens in the world. And likewise, if you imagine a being with robust agency but without consciousness, a being who can set and pursue goals based on cognitive states that function like beliefs and desires, I once again have a hard time imagining that it really matters to that being whether they satisfy their desires or achieve their goals. For me, it really does seem very intuitively plausible that it matters for you only when it feels good to you to achieve your goals, or it feels bad to you to fall short. So I think that might be a short way of putting it. Now, it is worth emphasizing that sentience is compatible with a wide range of types of positive and negative valence. We are not only talking about bodily pleasures and pains. We are talking about any conscious experience, any subjective experience that feels good or bad in any way, shape, or form. So that can include bodily pleasures and pains. It can include more emotional or intellectual satisfaction or frustration or happiness or suffering. So anything that you like or dislike subjectively, experientially, would be enough to make you a sentient being, and then enough to make it really matter to you what happens, and give you stakes in what happens. And that is when, for me, it starts to feel intuitively plausible that there is a kind of intrinsic moral significance that I have a responsibility to consider.
Yeah. So the sentience, almost by definition, is the capacity to value yourself or something about yourself. You want to care about yourself in some way. And then the common sense view of morality is that it's to do with whether we care about others because they care about themselves. And if you care about yourself in any way, however basic, you are a sentient being, I guess. Is that another way of putting it?
Yeah, that is another way of putting it, with the caveat that the agency view will claim those concepts too. So an agency view will say that an agent is a being with the capacity for belief and desire and intention and cares and concerns and goals that are selected and pursued in light of those beliefs and desires and intentions and cares and concerns. But we can imagine a being who has all of those functional behavioral capacities and sets and pursues goals in those ways, and then has those goals achieved or not, and has those desires satisfied or not, without being conscious at all, without being sentient at all, without having any subjective experience, without feeling like those goals need to be pursued or those desires need to be satisfied. So the debate between the sentientist and the agency theorist is not about whether moral standing depends on you valuing things, but is rather about what it takes to value things in the relevant sense, in the morally significant sense that gives you that intrinsic significance.
Yeah. And I had a fascinating conversation with Nico Delon on this topic, because he's done some really interesting work about that boundary. And I still count him as a sentientist because he does see sentience as, relevant. He includes every sentient being in his moral consideration, but he is looking at the boundary of that and saying, is it possible to have some form of value for an entity that doesn't require their ability to feel value themselves? And I struggle with that, because I imagine an agent that has, set goals and either achieves them or doesn't. And you could describe that as having a desire to achieve those goals, in that it has a configuration of information processing or a behavioral pattern that implies it's trying to achieve the goal. And you could call that desire. I still ultimately struggle that because the being themselves feels no different. There's absolutely nothing whether those goals are achieved or not. So you could thwart their goals in the most brutal manner, and the being themselves feels no different. And that feels to me like the being themselves doesn't value even their own goals, which removes the moral salience. But I think Nico's work and what you're implying there is that is there some wiggle room between the being's ability to feel value and there still being some sort of concept of value there, even if the being doesn't feel? Am I getting that roughly right?
Yeah, that is exactly the situation. And this goes back to your cautionary note about the metaphor of the moral circle, because we are both sentient and agentic as humans. And for us, we experience the value of our desires and goals through our consciousness. And so, of course, it seems plausible to us that consciousness is an important ingredient in the significance of our goals and desires and agency. But we have to allow for the possibility, at least I think, that there could be some kind of intrinsic value in pure, robust agency stripped of consciousness, even if it might be difficult for us to intuitively imagine that as conscious and agentic beings. So this is where that not just desire to get along with other people in the context of disagreement, but also really wanting to be a little bit humble given our limited perspective and our limited ability to imagine what it might not be like, but what kinds of intrinsic values might exist in other types of beings who are similar to us in some ways, but different to us in some ways. I think trying to cultivate that openness is important, even if ultimately you do have a lot of confidence still in your own favorite theory of moral standing.
Yeah, thank you. And in a way, there's an analogous tension when you talk about sentience as you defined it versus consciousness, and often these terms are sometimes used synonymously. I quite like focusing on sentience in sentientism, partly because it enables us to sort of sidestep philosophy of mind to some degree, whereas I think the definition of consciousness itself can get drawn into that in different ways, whereas I think sentience sometimes has a chance of being able to stand back and say, well, whatever your philosophy of mind, if it feels good or bad, that matters. But there's also a distinction you made there, which was between consciousness as being a capacity for any sort of awareness, and sentience being an awareness that is specifically valent, so like you said, can feel good or bad in whatever way that is. And I think that's a fascinating tension to explore for similar reasons to the tension with agency. And I came across this. I think David Chalmers gave a speech a few years ago, which I count as my first citation, even though I'm not an academic, because he put up a screenshot of one of my articles when he was discussing it. But he was talking about what he described as the choice between broad sentientism and narrow sentientism. So his idea of broad sentientism was you care about every conscious being, every being that has the capacity for awareness, whatever its nature, whereas a narrow sentientism focuses just on the valenced aspect of that. And that's really what you're discussing, but you're saying the former really is focusing on consciousness and sentience is specifically valenced, which I think is the way it's most often used in the literature these days. But it leads to a similar sort of question, because David had a thought experiment of, I think he was talking about the Vulcans, which again is a slightly warped version of, a sci-fi Star Trek story about a being that could be conscious. They are subjectively aware, but they have absolutely zero valence. So in a sense, it pulls at our intuitions in lots of different ways, because David's conclusion really was, even though this being has no valence at all, so in a sense cannot care about anything or themselves, it would be horrendous to needlessly harm them. He felt that strong intuitive pull, so he was being drawn towards a broad sentientism. And I'm interested in your thoughts on that tension too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. A lot there. So just to reply to a few points that you made, at least briefly. First of all, yes, the terminology is confusing. Different people use these terms in different ways. Consciousness, as you know, for many people means being awake instead of asleep, or being self-conscious as opposed to not self-conscious. Here we are using it in the phenomenal consciousness sense to describe what happens when it feels like something to be you, when you can have subjective experiences that feel like something from the inside. And then sentience, as you say, is consciousness plus valence in a certain sense. So not only does it feel like something to be you, but it can feel good or bad. You can have feelings or experiences that you like or dislike. So yeah, consciousness is the ability to have feelings, and then sentience is the ability to have feelings that are positive or negative, good or bad, that you like or that you dislike. And here I have some bad news for you. We are not able to avoid philosophy of mind if we focus on sentience instead of consciousness. If anything, we have to do more philosophy of mind, because now we have to think not only about the conditions for consciousness, but also about the conditions for valence, and about how consciousness and valence need to be connected in order to add up to sentience. That is not a trivial step, right? We might be able to presume that all animals who are conscious are also sentient because we share an evolutionary history with them, and they likewise have a bodily ability to detect helpful and harmful stimuli that they use for survival purposes. But when we think about designs for AI systems, for example, we might observe that they have many of the ingredients for consciousness architecturally and computationally. And we might observe that they have an ability to detect helpful and harmful stimuli. But we then have to ask, are those hooked up in a way that could plausibly add up to conscious experiences that feel good or bad? And the science of that and the philosophy of that is pretty impoverished in comparison to the science and philosophy of consciousness right now. So if anything, we have more work to do, sorry to say, but we can perhaps return to that. To answer your question about the Vulcans, yeah, this is an area where I am not persuaded by this kind of thought experiment. I definitely share the intuition that there is intrinsic moral significance in this kind of conscious and agentic being. However, I think that we can explain that intuition while still affirming the idea that sentience, valenced conscious experience is a necessary condition for moral standing. So in particular, when I try to imagine this being, I am imagining someone who is conscious, having subjective experiences, and robustly agentic, setting and pursuing their own goals in a self-directed manner. And just because of my own experience as a human and my experience of others as humans, I think I have a very hard time intuitively disentangling the idea of a conscious and agentic being from the idea of a conscious and sentient and agentic being. I have a very hard time imagining someone who consciously is having desires and preferences and setting and pursuing goals and having them be satisfied and frustrated without having any kind of bodily or emotional or intellectual positive or negative experience as part of those activities. And so I think that,
and even if you could disentangle them, how sure should we be, right? Back to your earlier point.
yeah. So I think my intuitions are drawing from me imagining someone who really is having some at least weekly positive or negative experience. But that is one cause for concern. Another is more perhaps virtue ethical or care ethical. I have this impression, and this is similar to what Kant argued about animals, even though he denied that they are intrinsically morally significant, that even if someone lacks sentience and therefore lacks moral standing according to the sentientist view, once they look and act exactly like a sentient being and have many of these same ingredients like consciousness and robust agency, I might have a responsibility to treat them as though they matter, simply as a way of cultivating a disposition to express respect and compassion and care towards beings who function and behave in this kind of way, in order to train myself, prime myself for treating actually sentient beings with the right kind of care. So even if you just stipulate that they lack moral standing, there could be a good case for treating them as though they have moral standing on kind of virtue ethics grounds or care ethics grounds. So I think there are a lot of ways to explain the intuition that this individual has moral standing, even if you want to affirm the sentientist view. Now, am I certain that these arguments are good ones? No. And this is part of why I think humility requires giving a little bit of weight to the idea that they do have moral significance. But if the question is, how do I philosophically assess that case, then that is my answer.
Yeah, thank you. And again, it's tricky, like with the agency case, because I think our consciousness and our sentience are so tightly bound together, it's hard for us to disentangle them. And you can argue that, again, a lot of the evolutionary story about potentially how consciousness came to emerge or be developed was because sentience itself, feeling the valence, was probably the thing that made it adaptive in the first place. So there's an evolutionary story about why they should be tied together. So it's hard to disentangle them.
Exactly. Yeah.
Although there are some meditators who will tell you that they think they can achieve a state of human consciousness that is completely neutral and valence-free and even free of time. Right? I'm a little skeptical about, but what that leads to in the thought experiment is this, I'm imagining this Vulcan being, like you say, a rich behavior with rich experience of some sort and behavioral repertoire, but at the same time, we have to think that being literally wouldn't mind being tortured. I mean, they wouldn't care either way, and it's just such a alien concept for us to, get our heads around. I think that can be difficult. But like you say, when we start thinking about entities that aren't like us or aren't even biological, right, you're going to have to struggle with some of these, these difficult disentanglements that we're not used to. So, yeah,
yeah.
Now, so that sets out some of the core ideas of the criteria you'd use. One thing, a challenge I've faced myself was when I interviewed Josh Gellers a while back. He's quite a strong critic of sentientism in general, but also, any approach that uses a property or a criteria or a characteristic of an entity as a qualification criteria. So, the cynical view would be, if you pick something like sentience, isn't there a worry that we're just doing what us humans have always done, which is we pick a characteristic of ourselves that we declare as important, and then we assess others for how like us they are, and the more like us they are, the more they matter. And we know, the horrors that can lead to within intrahuman ethics, right? And aren't we just doing the same by picking sentience as a characteristic? And in a way, he prefers a more hybrid approach, or one that takes a deeply relational approach that doesn't think about characteristics at all. It thinks about the nature of relations, and maybe also takes on a less, it's not turning away from a naturalistic approach, but it's turning away from a more narrow scientific approach that thinks about probabilities, characteristics, and physical matter, and thinks maybe more about emotions and relations and connections. What do you think of that broad challenge to the properties approach?
Yeah, I think that is a really interesting and important challenge, and that it gets a lot right. So first of all, it is true that we are asking and answering these questions from an anthropocentric perspective, from a human-centric perspective. And we do have this history of going down a list of properties, capacities that we ourselves possess, and then deciding one at a time, this is the one that matters. No, this is the one that matters. No, this is the one that matters. And so yeah, against the background of that history, where we started by saying you need to be a certain kind of human, and then, oh no, you need to be a human in general, and then, oh no, you need to be a linguistic and rational being in general, and now, oh no, you need to be a sentient being in general. That is part of a troubling pattern where we just keep picking a slightly broader, slightly more widely possessed capacity that is central to our experience of our own significance, and then treat that as the marker for what you need to matter in any way, shape, or form. And I think that should give us pause. Now, is there a way around it? Not necessarily, because ultimately we are interacting with these beings, whether we like it or not. And our own human perspective is inescapable. And so we have to do the best we can to ask who might matter and what they might need and what we might owe them from our human perspective, notwithstanding the bias and ignorance that we are increasingly becoming aware of. So I think that it is a good cautionary tale, but also an inescapable, unavoidable part of our predicament as moral agents who are trapped within our own perspective and our own life form. When it comes to the actual proposal that we replace a property view with a relational view, I think that the better proposal would be to combine a property view with a relational view, which is what I try to do. And I think that would be important even for the relational view, because if you think that relationships of various kinds are what matter for morality, you need to think at least a little bit about properties and capacities in order to understand what kinds of relationships are at stake in particular situations. For example, whether you have bonds of care and mutual affection with someone depends in part on whether you each have the individual capacity to experience affection for another being, right? And whether you have a certain kind of bond of vulnerability or like power control over the vulnerable depends in part on whether they have properties or capacities that render them vulnerable in particular ways. And so I think that Josh and others are right to point out our troubling history of being overly anthropocentric without properly correcting for our biases and ignorance. I think Josh is right to point to the importance of relationships in at least practical ethics, if not theoretical ethics too. However, I think that Josh is wrong if this is what he means, to think that that can be a replacement for or alternative to a good faith assessment of what capacities or properties might matter and who might have them and what might follow for our interactions with them. I just think we have no way out but through as far as that goes. And we should just study that as carefully as possible in combination with a similarly careful examination of which relationships might matter.
Yeah, thank you. And part of my frustration with the relational approach, because I see relationships as deeply important because they're so important to sentient beings rather than the other way around. But even if you just look at relations, you can't look at relations in isolation. That doesn't even make any sense, right? But I worry that actually the nature of relations is even more vulnerable to warping by the powerful than characteristics are, because it is by definition the powerful that get to define the nature of the relations. And if the nature of those relations justifies needlessly harming others, that nature of relation might be, someone who is enslaved or an animal that is farmed, right? That's a relational stance as well. So I almost see that the characteristic, the property, is almost like a bulwark against those types of oppression, because at least you can have a scientific or a naturalistic grounding that can say whatever the nature of the relations the powerful have defined, you can appeal to the sentience of a entity regardless of their relations and say they should matter. And I guess I counter the anthropocentrism challenge, because again, I think it is a really important challenge we should always be aware of, and we can never entirely escape from because we're humans. So that view will also always be anthropocentric. one thing that helps is that sentience seems very likely to have been around for hundreds of millions of years before humans. And if we look across the world today, humans are a vanishingly tiny percentage of all the sentient beings. So that helps, frame it as something that counters anthropocentrism for me. It puts humans in a much more humble place rather than it being taking the sentience of humans and then using that as a criteria. But
yeah. So just a couple of thoughts about that. The first is, I agree. There are, of course, degrees of anthropocentrism here and degrees of anthropomorphism here. And the broader we go, the more we look to capacities of ours that are more widely shared, the more that does induce a kind of humbler orientation to our own place in the moral universe, and that is helpful. Now, I think critics are still right to point out that we are ultimately just selecting a somewhat broader capacity that is still central to our experience of our own moral significance. And it could be possible to go broader still, to think about agency without sentience, or life without agency. And then we would be humbler still. We would be thinking about an even broader moral universe where humanity is even less significant, relatively speaking. So I think those replies of yours make sense, though I think there is still some truth to the critique that merits careful consideration. Now, one point that you made that I would make a little bit differently is, I agree with you that the relational view is susceptible to its own critique of the properties view. In other words, we are a particular kind of being with a particular kind of mind and a particular set of relationships, casting judgment on other kinds of minds and other kinds of relationships through our own experience, right? And that can lend bias both to the properties view and to the relational view, right? When it comes to the properties view, we might be projecting our own experience of our own properties onto an assessment of what other properties might matter and who might have them. And then for the relational view, we might be projecting our own experience of our own morally significant kinds of relationships onto the other sorts of relations and interactions that exist in the world. And similar biases can crop up, similar problems can crop up either way. However, I would not say that this problem exists more for the relational view than for the property view in the way that you suggested, in part because the relational theorists can reply in the same kind of way that the property theorists can, that it is not ultimately up to us which relationships matter. And this is a common idea in feminist care ethics, for example. So feminist care ethics say, hey, emotions and relationships are a really important part of morality. And then other people say, oh, so I get to decide who matters to me based on who my friends and family are. And then the feminist care ethicist says, no. That might be one morally significant type of relationship, but patterns of power and oppression, for example, are another morally significant kind of relationship. And when you wield power over someone and when you oppress someone, then that gives you certain responsibilities towards them, whether you like it or not, whether you announce that this is a morally significant kind of relationship or not. So I think that the properties people can offer that kind of reply, and the relational people can offer that kind of reply. So basically, we are all stuck in the same predicament here.
Yeah, thank you. So we've framed a choice of some criteria that you want to use pluralistically and open-mindedly, and with uncertainty around sentience and agency and consciousness. And you hinted earlier on that you yourself have gone through a journey about, okay, who then matters if we use those sort of criteria. So what's your thinking at the moment about where the edges of these concepts are? Where is the boundary of meaningful agency? Does a Roomba or a thermostat count, or does that not quite count? And the same with sentience, right? How far out does it get across the animal kingdom, across substrates, even through the developmental life cycle of a human from conception to death, right? That's a crazily broad question. I should ask a better question, but how have you come to think about the edges and therefore who does get included if we use these criteria?
Yeah, this gets into the ethics of risk and uncertainty, because my view is that we should be somewhat ecumenical and pluralistic, both about the facts and about the values, in light of ongoing substantial disagreement and uncertainty about the facts and the values. And when it comes to our own decision-making in everyday life, we should extend at least some moral consideration. We should include within the boundaries of the moral circle every being who has at least a realistic, non-negligible, non-trivial chance of mattering based on the best information and arguments currently available. So again, on the ethics side, we have disagreement and uncertainty about whether sentience is required for moral standing, or whether consciousness without sentience is enough, or whether agency without consciousness is enough. And then likewise, on the science side, we have ongoing disagreement and uncertainty about what it takes to possess each of those capacities in the relevant morally significant sense. So for example, to be conscious, do you need to have a brain with the exact materials and structures and functions of human or mammalian or avian brains? Or is it enough to have a sophisticated cognitive system with broadly analogous capacities for perception, attention, learning, memory, self-awareness, social awareness, etc.? Or is it enough to have even a simpler cognitive system with a basic ability to process information or represent objects in your environment? These are really contested issues, both on the ethics side and on the science side, and they are going to remain contested for the foreseeable future. We are not on the cusp of some secure theory of moral standing or some secure theory of consciousness about which everyone can feel certain at the same time. So my view is that, yes, we should try to improve our understanding. We should try to make progress on these issues in ethics and science. And in the meantime, we have a responsibility to exercise caution in our interactions with beings who might be sentient or otherwise morally significant when making decisions that affect them. And when you take that approach to the topic, you realize, oh wow, if the bar for at least minimal moral consideration is not definitely they matter or probably they matter, but rather possibly they matter, they have at least a realistic, non-negligible, non-trivial chance of mattering, at least say a 1 in 1,000 chance of mattering. If that is the bar, then it turns out a lot of beings meet that standard. A lot of beings hit that bar. And in my view, unfortunately, that definitely includes all vertebrates, many invertebrates, including insects, and at least some near future AI systems. And possibly it also includes plants, fungi, microscopic organisms, etc. So this is where it gets sort of surprising and provocative, and where the implications become kind of confusing.
Yeah. And it's I think in a way, moral philosophy is all about, ongoing steps of having your mind blown. And I think, you start from the idea that we're, a type of evolved ape that evolved these brains to do a certain thing on the savannah, living in reasonably small groups and, cooperating and, working out how to survive and reproduce. And then you're in a position of, through a series of steps, recognizing the sheer scale of humanity. And that itself is mind-blowing, thinking about not just the 8 billion humans today, but all the potential future humans. That itself is very hard for our funny little ape brains to get their heads around. And there's another radical step, which is thinking about non-human animals at all. And you're pushing the boundaries even further beyond that. I think that's, in a way, to my mind, that's part of the role of good philosophy, is it doing that exactly that work, however uncomfortable it might be. So you talked already about the scope across the non-human animal world, how far that might go out, and even into the non-animal taxa as a potential. I'm interested in your thoughts on the AI front itself as well, because we've gone from very simplistic chatbots to quite impressive chatbots to a range of very narrow AIs with a powerful capability, potentially the much more generally capable and powerful AIs that are under development right now. How do you approach that space of assessing whether they matter? Because it's a very typical story when we're talking about non-human animals like Smokey lying next to you, is that there's lines of inference we can refer to because we're, evolved biological entities like he is, right? But we don't have some of that stuff to draw on when we're thinking about artificial entities. How do you think about that space and where the edges might lie?
Yeah, great question. Fortunately, we can use broadly the same kind of methodology to assess animals and AI systems for evidence of sentience, consciousness, agency, other morally significant features, but the details do have to differ for exactly the reasons you suggest. So in general, we can use what we call a marker or indicator method to assess different non-human minds for consciousness, for instance. And the way this method works is you can start by introspecting to tell the difference between conscious processing and non-conscious processing in your own experience. So I can introspectively tell the difference, for example, between when I feel pain versus having an unfelt nociceptive response, an unfelt detection of noxious stimuli. I can then examine what types of behavioral and anatomical properties are associated with conscious processing in humans. And I can then go look for broadly similar behavioral and anatomical or architectural properties in non-humans of various kinds. So with other animals, we can look not only for whether they have the same brain and body structures that light up when I feel pain, but also, do they nurse their own wounds? Do they respond to analgesics and antidepressants in the same ways as us? Do they make behavioral trade-offs between the avoidance of pain and the pursuit of other valuable goals? Now, when we find those properties, that is not proof that they are conscious. It does not establish certainty. Proof and certainty are not available without a secure theory of consciousness, but it does count as evidence, and it increases the probability of consciousness. And that can still be valuable information when making decisions about how to study and how to interact with these beings. Now, with AI systems, we are not able at present to trust that same kind of behavioral evidence in that same kind of way for exactly the reasons that you mentioned. We lack the kinds of anatomical and evolutionary continuities with AI systems that would allow us to treat that as evidence of the same nature. But first of all, we might be able to develop AI systems whose behaviors are stronger evidence for the presence or absence of consciousness. And second of all, even at present without that, we can look underneath their potentially misleading behaviors for underlying architectural evidence that they have computational properties associated with perception, attention, learning, memory, self-awareness, social awareness, language, reason, flexible decision-making, a kind of global workspace that coordinates activity across these modules. And again, if we find these architectural computational features, and if we find them interacting in the right kind of way, that might not be proof. It might not establish certainty. Again, proof and certainty are not available, but it can at least count as evidence and increase the probability. And again, that can still be useful. Now, when we look at AI systems for that kind of architectural or computational evidence, what we find right now is there is not all that much evidence of consciousness or sentience, for example, in current large language models and other AI systems, but there are also no clear technical barriers towards the development of AI systems in the very near future with advanced and integrated versions of all of these capabilities. And there are a lot of incentives for AI companies and governments to race towards the creation of exactly those kinds of AI systems, because many of the same capabilities that are associated with consciousness are also associated with intelligence. Now, conscious and intelligence are not the same thing, but they might to some extent overlap. So we might accidentally create consciousness in the course of trying to create intelligence. So that is why,
which is arguably maybe how our consciousness and our intelligence evolved, right? Because you can imagine an evolutionary path where our intelligence was enough to guide us to be evolutionarily successful, but it just so happened that feeling, go towards the good, go away from the bad, came along with the package, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you. That's fascinating. And there's we could cover like 5 hours just on that topic, but I mentioned before that, I try and keep, sentientism itself as a worldview somewhat independent of philosophy of mind, pluralistic about philosophy of mind, which I think you probably like to do as well, in that we can say, whether sentience and consciousness are fundamental to physics, as a panpsychist might suggest, or whether it's a strongly emergent property of some sort, or whether it's just a morally salient illusion, or as Francois Camera might say it doesn't exist at all. I think even if you stuck a fork in the back of Francois Camera's hand, it would still hurt him and it would still matter, right? So in that sense, the Sentientism worldview sort of backs away from that and says, whatever you think it is, it still matters, even if it's just an illusion. But at the same time, these things do overlap when you're thinking about who matters morally, because particularly if you include the idea of consciousness as well as sentience as one of your criteria, and you give some credence to a panpsychist philosophy of mind, that does attribute at least some very minimal micro-consciousness, even to fundamental particles, electrons, photons, and so on. That's a properly mind-blowing, potential expansion of your moral scope that goes even beyond ecocentrism. I mean, what's your sense about how panpsychism and these ideas might link?
Yeah, this great question and great framing. And this is part of how I ended up in the situation I described towards the start of our conversation, where I was setting out in writing my book to argue for at least some moral consideration for all vertebrates and many invertebrates, and at least some advanced near future AI systems. But then I found myself convinced by my own arguments to go much farther still. And you gestured at one of the kinds of reasons why. Now, this is not the only reason why, but it is among the reasons why. I just described an incredibly complicated marker or indicator method that we can use to very carefully assess animals and AI systems for evidence of consciousness and then estimate probabilities of consciousness. But then there are also these kinds of shortcuts, right? Because as you say, many philosophers agree that consciousness is itself sufficient for moral standing. And many philosophers agree that consciousness is a basic property of all matter. This is the panpsychist view. There are, of course, also other permissive views of consciousness, like consciousness is a basic property of any information processing system of a certain sort, or any representational system of a certain sort. And as long as you have a non-negligible credence in the conjunction of consciousness about moral standing and panpsychism or some other similarly permissive view about consciousness, that by itself will establish a non-negligible chance of moral significance in a truly astonishing number of beings, perhaps even microscopic particles, right? Forget about microscopic organisms, microscopic particles. and I think we got to take that seriously. I mean, if you look at philosophical surveys, you see, I think this is from memory, I could be a little bit off, but around 7% of professional philosophers accepting or leaning toward panpsychism about consciousness. We should not dismiss that as a serious view about consciousness, given how difficult the subject is, how mysterious the phenomenon is, and how many views are really live and defended in the literature right now.
Yeah, follow it where it leads. And I've had some fascinating conversations on the podcast with people who tend towards that view, people like David Pearce and Emerson Green and Luke Roloffs. And particularly with Luke, it was really interesting to explore how these questions intersect, because I don't give much credence to the panpsychist view, but we almost found that there's an independent way of coming back to something that might feel a little bit more common sense, where you could, again, using your definition earlier on of the difference between consciousness and sentience, say, well, maybe electrons and photons have some minimal micro consciousness. But if it's hard to imagine how a photon could feel something good or bad, then maybe there are micro consciousness that is not sentient, and maybe it's only macro consciousnesses above a certain, criteria that are therefore sentient and then centered in our moral consideration. So, for Luke, for example, in practical terms, he's vegan like you and me. We set our moral scope primarily on sentience in probably roughly similar ways, even though he has a much more expansive stance about where consciousness might go to. So even on that difference, there can be some quite interesting, paths to navigate through depending on which criteria you take seriously. So,
yeah, there are all kinds of further arguments that we can make to reassure ourselves that we do not at present have a responsibility to allocate all of our resources to like electron welfare. And one of them is, as you say, as Luke says, if we think sentience is necessary as opposed to consciousness being sufficient, then we might think that, okay, some proto-consciousness or minimal consciousness exists even in microscopic particles, but they might not have the kinds of agency or detection of helpful and harmful stimuli that then allows for valence and then the right kind of connection between consciousness and valence. So they might fall below the threshold for moral consideration for that reason. You can also note that panpsychists also need to accept a certain theory of combination, and that means that they need to have a theory about what it takes for these minimally conscious particles to come together in a way that allows the whole structure to have consciousness as well. You can be a panpsychist who thinks that there is at least minimal consciousness in particles, while also thinking that it takes a very special kind of combination for objects composed out of particles to be conscious, and then further special properties required for valence and sentience. And then of course you can also make other remarks about moral weight and welfare. So there are all kinds of complications that block us from needing to start paying a lot of attention to electron welfare right now. But I think what you and I are currently noting, and what Luke and others note, is that we should not dismiss out of hand the possibility that after sufficient thought with sufficient care, there might be some kind of responsibility owed even to particles in the fullness of time once we put all these ideas together in the right kind of way.
Yeah. And at the beginning of that answer, you said, trying to reassure ourselves, right? And I can feel myself wanting to do that, right? Because we want to draw ourselves back to some sort of common sense bucket of intuitions. And that's what you're challenging us on, is to say, well, yeah, okay, we all feel that way, but if we really want to do philosophy properly, you've got to, follow the thinking where it leads. Yeah. So the final question I had for you about, who's included, is about the future. So I think most people intuitively will have a sense that, beings that exist today of whatever criteria, of course they can matter, because the moment to moment they can feel things, they can experience things, they can have goals, they can have agency. But what about beings that don't exist yet and may never exist? How should we think about them in your framework?
Yeah, I do think that we have a responsibility to all stakeholders affected by our actions and policies. Now that does again require combining the properties and relational view in a certain kind of way, right? All stakeholders, that is a property claim. In other words, individuals who are vulnerable in a certain kind of way, either in virtue of their sentience or in virtue of their consciousness or in virtue of their agency, who are affected by our actions and policies. And this is a relational remark, right? We need to have a certain kind of causal relationship with these vulnerable beings in order to have a responsibility to consider them and to consider our impacts on them in the relevant kind of way. And so I do think that there can be some spatial and temporal boundaries for the moral circle, not based on the intrinsic properties of particular beings, but rather based on our own causal interactions with them and causal relationships with them. And then, practically speaking, our ability to predict and control our causal impacts on them and relationships with them. However,
so they might matter, but that might not matter if there's nothing we can do about it, or we're not.
Yeah, they might matter, but we might not have a responsibility to consider our impacts on them if we in fact have no impacts on them, or if we would be totally clueless about our impacts on them. But I do think that we have at least a minimal ability to make educated guesses about our impacts on a pretty vast number and wide range of beings, both locally and globally, both at present and in the future. And if we invest in building knowledge, building capacity, building political will, we could improve our ability to predict and control our direct and indirect impacts on local and global, present and future, human and non-human stakeholders. And so I think even right now, notwithstanding our current limitations, we ought to consider our impacts on, for example, many future non-humans. And then we also ought to specifically invest in improving our ability to do exactly that kind of work so that we can more reliably predict and control our impacts on an even larger number of future non-humans, an even more distant set of future non-humans moving forward.
Yeah, thank you. And I find it another interesting analog because most humans around the world will balk at the idea of seriously including, for example, our fellow non-human animals in moral consideration, at the same time as already having an intuition where they do at least care about some non-human animals. So they've already gone beyond the human boundary in their moral consideration already, and we're just asking them to take it seriously. And it feels similar to me in the thinking about future being space, because people will balk at the idea of considering far future beings, particularly if they're non-human. But again, almost every human already cares about future beings, right? I mean, that's one of the major drivers behind our concern for the environment. It's not just about the beings who are living now, it's about future beings too. So it's really interesting how on some of these ideas, philosophical ideas, you can feel a really strong, robust pushback from people that have already accepted the basics, and they just it's a struggle to work through the implications, which I guess is part of our human psychology.
Yeah, I totally agree with you about that. I will note, I think there is reasonable grounds for making some distinctions here, right? Like, we can be more confident that mammals and birds are sentient and conscious than that other vertebrates and many invertebrates are sentient and conscious. We can be more confident about our ability to predict and control our impacts on the next generation and the generation after that than on, for example, individuals living in other galaxies and future millennia. And so I think even if we acknowledge that everyone intrinsically matters equally in the sense that everyone merits equal consideration of interests, we might nevertheless think that we ought to apply a kind of discount rate across species or across space and time in virtue of our own limited knowledge and own limited ability to predict and control the impacts of our policies on these beings. So I think that there is room for, at least in practice, those kinds of uncertainties and those kinds of discounting. But as you and I are saying, that does not totally eliminate the need to consider your impacts on, for example, distant future non-humans. It might just mean you can give them a little bit less weight, all else being equal, relatively speaking. But you still might need to give them a lot of weight overall, and that can still make a really big difference for your decisions today.
Yeah, thank you. Well, that links to the next question I was going to explore with you, because one response to this sort of mind-blowing, you know, sextillions and maybe even bigger numbers than that of beings that we might now have to consider in our moral scope is to reassure ourselves that maybe they matter in different degrees, right? So maybe that is one way of coming back to something that feels a bit more comfortable for us. And maybe a good way into this question about, okay, how much should different beings matter is from a fascinating conversation I had. So I run workshops in schools about different types of worldviews, including Sentientism. And I did one recently with a group of 16, 17-year-olds. And we were talking about using sentience to set moral scope. And one of the challenges they gave to me, I think, cuts to the heart of this, because they were almost saying, well, you have two choices here. You can either suggest that a mosquito and a human being have exactly the equal, moral worth, right? You take a totally egalitarian stance across all sentient beings. If you're sentient, you matter. That's it. And you all matter the same. So if there's a mosquito or a human in a burning building and you can only save one, you flip a coin because there is no differentiation at all. Or a situation where you grade moral consideration, you think that some matter more than others. And, their worry, and I thought it was a really astute question from a, 17-year-old, was, does that lead you into a position where you might be being ableist, right? Where you would look at different humans and say, well, different capacities, different mental capacities, maybe different degrees of sentience, maybe some humans matter more than others. And, where do you end up? So they were almost presenting it as these two, really worrying alternatives. I don't know if there's a good way into the conversation, but how do you think about, how much should these different sextillions of beings matter, and how can we navigate that intelligently?
Yeah, that sounds like it was a great conversation, and good on your students to just exist in that confused state and recognize the problems with both approaches. Because yes, this presumption of human equality is this like hard fought partial victory, right? I call it a partial victory because obviously not everybody accepts human equality, and we are always at risk of backsliding to the extent that we have made progress. But this idea that many of us share, that all humans are equal and deserve equal consideration, notwithstanding how smart and strong they are, notwithstanding membership in particular morally arbitrary social and biological categories. That is a really big deal, and this idea of reintroducing ranking and hierarchy into the moral community feels really fraught against that background, right? Against that context. At the same time, as you say, if we refuse to allow for any kind of ranking or hierarchy with respect to intrinsic value or worth in the moral community, then we are literally flipping a coin. If a house is burning down and I can either save you or a fruit fly, then all else being equal, I should actually flip a coin instead of saving you because you have perhaps a greater capacity for pleasure, pain, happiness, suffering, satisfaction, frustration, goals, and so on and so forth. And those are both quite challenging ideas to take seriously and to accept. And as you say, there is this lurking concern about ableism and ageism and these other sorts of human oppressions and forms of prejudice and discrimination too. Because if you think that individuals with, for example, a more complex brain or greater capacity for language and reason matter more, then does that mean some humans matter more than others? If you think that individuals with a longer lifespan matter more, does that mean that like younger humans matter more than older humans? So there are those concerns. Now, Shelley Kagan is an example of a philosopher who tries to have it both ways. He tries to argue for a ranking hierarchical approach across species, but then for an egalitarian approach within species. And he does that on what he calls practical realist grounds. So he basically argues, listen, in principle, yes, beings have greater or lesser amounts of intrinsic moral value based on their degree of welfare, their degree of agency. But because we are, imperfect beings with imperfect minds, we are not able to detect reliably or precisely little subtle differences in welfare or agency. And so if we try to discern these differences within species, that will probably do more harm than good. We probably make more mistakes than we refine our thinking about this, because the differences are so small in the grand scheme of things, and the risk of error is so great, So yes, perhaps there might be little subtle differences here and there within species, but since it would do more harm than good for us to try to detect those, we should just presume equality within species in practice, and then we can search for broad opportunities to engage in at least some ranking or hierarchy across species. So this is an attempt to try to have it both ways. Now, for my purposes in the book, I am not really coming down one way or the other on this debate. Instead, my interest is in rejecting human exceptionalism, this idea that humanity always matters most and always takes priority, both individually and collectively. And all I note about that is no matter what, human exceptionalism is in trouble. Because if you go egalitarian, then guess what? All those fruit flies are obviously going to matter more than us in the aggregate. And if you get into the business of ranking and hierarchy, then okay, fine. I might matter more than an individual fruit fly, but a sufficiently large number of individual fruit flies will still matter more than me in the aggregate. And by the way, in the future, there could be much more sophisticated AI systems who have much more complex brains and much longer lifespans than humans. And so they might end up mattering more than we do, according to this ranking and hierarchy view. So all I care to say is any reasonable combination of views about these issues is going to spell trouble for human exceptionalism.
Yeah. And I think there's enormous value, even if we struggle to answer that question and we need to still navigate it and work it through, of setting a baseline of who gets included at all. Right? Even that is a radically positive step forward. But the grading thing is challenging. And I think, again, there's two perspectives here, at least two, right? And what it's interesting to think about in the animal advocacy world, because one deep worry about grading is that it will reinforce human exceptionalism. So many people will turn to more of a rights view or a rejection of use and exploitation and instrumentalization and, the right not to be owned, because there's a sense that rights might be a more robust defense of a sentient being, whereas a more graded view, the extreme of the graded view that people are worried about is, okay, all sentient beings matter, for example, but humans matter more because we are, for some, somehow more sentient than a pig. So my passing interest in, having a bacon sandwich is more important than that pig's interest in having a long and happy life, right? So they're worried about a slippery slope where you can almost get into a tokenistic trap, which is, I think, where most humans are, where they want to claim they care without actually putting that into practice. So the sort of more rights-based view is, it can give itself more of a problem around the egalitarianism, but it's at least trying to say, look, at least we need to find some defensive baseline. And I should stop rambling on, but how do you think we can, one, set the moral scope, but also talk about some sort of minimal moral obligation that should flow from that, so that we cannot end up in a position where people say they care or have compassion or want to treat others humanely while still doing terrible things to them? What baseline, is there a baseline we can draw?
Yes. So first of all, to respond to your point about rights, which I think is really well taken, rights theorists are going to face this kind of difficulty too. Everybody is going to face this difficulty. Everybody needs to confront the question whether everyone matters equally or some beings matter more than others. And within rights theory, you have different camps. So some conceive of rights as trumping any welfare stakes, no matter how great the welfare stakes are. And then others conceive of rights as trumping welfare stakes up to a point. But then once you cross a certain threshold, sufficiently high welfare stakes could end up trumping rights. So this is a kind of threshold approach to rights. And yes, if you accept that non-threshold approach to rights, like if you have a right, then it trumps any kind of welfare stakes, then there is this blunt kind of egalitarianism that rights introduces into the moral picture, and it constrains our decision-making in a fairly egalitarian spirit across species, across substrates. But if you go to the threshold view, then you might think that the threshold where rights become violable could vary from species to species or substrate to substrate based on their welfare capacities or their moral worth, right? So for example, if your view is that I have a right to life, which means you should not kill me to save 5 people, but maybe you should kill me to save like 1,000 people or 1,000,000 people, like whatever the threshold is. Now imagine that I matter 1,000,000 times more than an ant, right? Does that mean that you should like divide by 1,000,000 to figure out what the threshold is for being permitted to kill an ant? So this is where this ends up mattering for rights theorists too. But to answer your question directly, I agree that we should accept a pluralist view, or at least I think that we should accept a pluralist view in practice, not only about who matters, but also about what we owe them for broadly the same reasons. One is moral uncertainty. I could be wrong about my own views. Another is the need for collaboration. We need to work together in spite of disagreement about moral theories. And then a third is the reality that no matter what moral theory we accept, we need to draw insights from other moral theories in order to act according to that theory in practice in everyday life. So even if I accept utilitarianism, this idea that I ought to maximize happiness and minimize suffering, the way to be a good utilitarian is not to go around asking how to be a good utilitarian all the time, asking how to maximize happiness and minimize suffering. The way to be a good utilitarian is to, broadly speaking, set good goals in life and then select social and professional roles that will give you a platform for pursuing those goals. And then beyond that, really trying to respect rights and cultivate virtuous character traits that will allow you to be good in your roles and cultivate caring relationships that will allow you to get along well with others and support them and be supported by them and build just and fair social structures that incentivize good behaviors from everyone. That is the way to be a good utilitarian, being a good rights theorist and virtue theorist and care theorist in the context of the goals that you intend to pursue in your life. So I think for all kinds of reasons, we should indeed accept a robust set of rights and maintain a robust system of rights in society as a kind of check against biased and self-serving attempts to use risk-benefit analysis and expected utility reasoning in everyday life.
Yeah, thank you. And I think even that pluralistic approach, you can still find common ground. And I think in some of your previous work, you've talked about non-maleficence maybe being that baseline. Look, we at least wouldn't needlessly harm, exploit, or kill. And in this book, you talk about, doing less harm, right? So, and I think whatever your ethical system is, you can at least, you might fight to the death, but you can still
Exactly.
agree there is some baseline for these words like care, compassion, and humane treatment have to mean something, right? So I think there's
Exactly.
pluralism, yes, but there's still a solid foundation. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah,
Now,
exactly.
I need to let you go in a moment. I have one quick question before the final one, which is how does epistemology play into this? Because I framed the sentientism worldview as not just a compassion for at least all sentient beings, but also a commitment to using a broadly naturalistic evidence and reason. And that commitment does seem to infuse your thinking, because you talk about using evidence and reason, and that's part of the toolkit of modern philosophy to work through that stuff. And you also talk about something else I think is really important to good naturalistic epistemology, which is humility and epistemic openness and pluralism and a willingness to change your mind as the evidence changes. So it does seem to richly infuse your work. But at the same time, there are many people around the world who would read your book and go, well, you didn't talk about having a soul as a criteria for moral inclusion, and you didn't talk about divine command theory as an alternative moral system where ultimately we just do what the deity says to us. How do you think some of the, and more constructively, there are ideas from supernaturalistic worldviews like ahimsa, which actually align very much with our collective agenda as well. So how do you think about, naturalistic and non-naturalistic epistemologies and how they link to this?
Yeah. So I do think that a commitment to using evidence and reason to the best of our ability in the context of a broader decision procedure that, again, also includes like respecting rights and cultivating virtuous states of character and cultivating caring relationships, that is important for being a good person and leaving good impacts on the world. And so I think that is reasonable to include as part of the sentientist worldview. However, I think that kind of commitment to evidence and reason is compatible with having religious or secular foundational views about metaphysics or epistemology, right? Like,
yeah, it could lead you anywhere, right? It can lead you anywhere.
exactly, right. You and I could both be committed to, yeah, following the evidence, exercising our capacity for reason, but I could think that it all bottoms out in a creator deity who placed us in this predicament, and you could think it all bottoms out in the Big Bang and the laws of nature and so on and so forth. But we could still be committed to sentientism. We could still be committed to harm reduction. We could still be committed to risk mitigation, and we could still be committed to evidence and reason in the pursuit of
and naturalistic
those broad
epistemology,
goals.
right? Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and so I think that the sentientism community should be regarded as a sufficiently big tent so that it can include people who think sentience is necessary, people who think agency is sufficient. It should include utilitarians and rights theorists, and it should include religious and secular folks, as long as they are all committed to those, basic presuppositions. Sentience is at least sufficient, and to the best of our ability, we ought to go about engaging in harm reduction and risk mitigation, and cultivate states of character and build social structures that can feed into that collaborative effort. So if religious folks want to get involved in that, I welcome them. As you say, I
absolutely.
did
Yeah,
not discuss religious worldviews in the book, mostly for reasons of space. There were a lot of issues that I had to pick and choose whether to include, and so I just focused on certain views as case studies for the kind of pluralism I want to endorse, like utilitarianism and rights theory, like sentience and agency. But in the fullness of time and in a sufficiently sophisticated version of the view, I would really want the pluralism to include religious worldviews too.
yeah. Brilliant. Thank you. So I've now given you like 3 minutes to update your answer to the question, how do we make a better future? And I did want to ask you again, because you do close out the book with some views on this, because in one sense, you may have just melted human minds with this expansion of our moral scope. So in practical terms, how do we, what do we do?
This actually probably will be similar to my response last time, because my view in this book is similar to my view in the previous book, but maybe a little bit more developed now, which is that the key is really accepting our responsibilities and limitations in equal measure. And what I mean by that is we owe a lot to the non-human world, but we also have profound limitations on our knowledge and our capacity and our political will. And a good way forward requires owning and accepting both of those realities. And I think that means combining a kind of radical aspiration towards egalitarianism and inclusion moving forward as a kind of long-term goal, but then also a quite moderate and incrementalist theory of change way of making progress towards that goal. And so I think we ought to work towards a future where we can extend as much consideration and allocate as many resources as possible to all of the non-humans who might matter according to the evidence available to us, but that we also have to work within our limitations. And that means, in the first instance, in this generation, seeking low cost, low hanging fruit, co-beneficial policies for humans and non-humans in the environment. So when we think about food systems, we can ask, well, what kinds of incremental informational and financial and regulatory and just transition policies can nudge us in the direction of a plant-based food system in a sustainable way? And when we think about infrastructure, we can ask, what similar kinds of infrastructure policies, as we make cities and other human communities more resilient and sustainable in the face of climate change, how can they be safer for humans and animals in the environment at the same time? And then we can think about bird safe glass and wildlife corridors and so on. And then when we develop AI, how can we find approaches to AI safety and AI welfare that are good for humans and AI systems and the environment at the same time? For example, exploring collaborative rather than adversarial ways of achieving AI safety and AI alignment. So I think those are all questions that we can be asking now, because that allows us to make incremental progress, to work within our limitations, to improve human lives and societies. But it builds momentum in the right direction. And then it gives us opportunities to collect that knowledge and that power and that political will. And then that allows us to go a little bit farther in each new generation. And so I do want to hold on to these radical goals of egalitarianism and inclusion, but then I just want to allow each generation to make a little bit more progress and then discover over time where to go next and what the next step to take is and how far we can get, rather than prejudging that stuff from the outset in a way that probably is going to be badly misguided. So it combines that kind of, radical goal with a kind of more conservative or moderate incrementalist strategy.
Yeah, thank you. And those goals, having them in mind, helps set the tone now. You talk in the book about path dependency, and maybe also helps set a better example for our future AI overlords about how to treat less powerful sentient beings. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Well, Jeff, that's been absolutely fascinating. Again, thank you so much for coming on again and for spending so much time with me. Very good luck with the book. It's a brilliant read and quite short too. In fact, I should do the book thing. Here it is.
Thank you. And thank you for saying that. I really appreciate it.
An actual physical book. No, I loved it. And so thank you. What's the best way of people following you, buying the book, of course, staying up to date with your ongoing portfolio of work?
Well, you can buy the book, The Moral Circle, at your favorite retailer. I should add, by the way, that my previous book that we discussed here and there, Saving Animals, Saving Ourselves, is now available open access. You can also get that one pretty easily too. And you can follow me on Twitter, Blue Sky, other social media platforms, and you can find me at Jeff Sebo, SEBO.net.
That's brilliant. Well, thank you again, Jeff. Please stay in touch, and wonderful to talk to you again.
Yeah, you too. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Jamie.